The forest was silent, too silent. December 1945, deep in the Black Forest. Snow fell in slow, uneasy spirals, landing on rusted helmets and broken rifles. A squad of American soldiers advanced cautiously, boots crunching over frozen leaves. Their mission was simple: secure the last German hideouts after the war. But what they found wasn't an enemy. A faint cry stopped them. Not the cry of a wounded man, but of a child. Private Miller raised his rifle, heart pounding. Another whimper echoed through the trees. Then, movement. From behind the wreckage of a burned wagon, a small figure emerged. Barefoot, covered in soot, eyes wide with terror. And then another, and another. 7 German children, some barely able to walk, stood trembling in the cold. Their parents, gone. Their village, bombed weeks ago. They had survived alone, stealing scraps from abandoned farms, hiding from soldiers, both American and German. Miller lowered his weapon. The forest exhaled. One of the soldiers whispered, "My God, they've been living out here?" The snow kept falling, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made. In that quiet moment, the victors of war stood face to face with its smallest survivors. The war had ended, at least on paper. But in Germany, 1945 didn't feel like peace. It felt like the ghost of war still wandering through the ruins. Cities lay in ashes, villages vanished from maps, fields were cratered, rivers clogged with wreckage, and forests had become the last refuge for those with nowhere else to go. As the American occupation forces pushed deeper into southern Germany, they found survivors, not soldiers, not resistance fighters, but civilians, scattered and starving. Many were children. The Black Forest had become one such sanctuary. Once a place of fairy tales and folklore, it was now a graveyard of silence and snow. The war had pushed families from their homes, bombings had severed train lines, and food convoys had long stopped arriving. For months, small bands of orphans, widows, and refugees drifted through the woods, surviving on whatever they could find. Among them were 7 children from a small village near Freiburg. Their father had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. Their mother, killed during an air raid that flattened their street. The oldest, a boy of 12, had gathered his younger siblings and escaped before the fighting reached them. They built makeshift shelters out of branches and tarps. They drank melted snow. They learned the difference between edible roots and poisonous ones. But as the winter deepened, hunger became their fiercest enemy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, the U.S. 36th Infantry Division was tasked with clearing any remaining pockets of resistance. Intelligence suggested that German holdouts and SS deserters were still hiding among civilians. Every movement in the trees could be a sniper or a starving refugee. Tension ran high. Every shadow looked dangerous. Captain William Harding, who led a small recon patrol that December morning, had already seen enough horror to last a lifetime. He'd fought from Normandy to the Rhine. He knew the war had officially ended in May, but the fear hadn't. Soldiers still died from ambushes, booby traps, or desperate men unwilling to surrender. When Harding's patrol entered that section of the Black Forest, they expected danger. What they found instead were the faint traces of human life. Small footprints, child-sized, half-filled with snow. He ordered his men to follow quietly. What they discovered next would challenge everything they thought they knew about victory, mercy, and the enemy they had been trained to hate. The soldiers moved cautiously, rifles raised, until one whisper echoed through the trees, a voice too small to belong to any soldier. That's when the truth of war revealed itself, not through blood or bullets, but through the eyes of hungry children. The soldiers froze where they stood. The footprints led them to a hollow beneath a fallen pine tree. From the shadows, 2 frightened eyes stared back. Then a child's voice, weak, trembling, called out something in German none of the men could understand. Private Miller knelt down, slowly lowering his rifle. "It's all right," he said softly, though the words meant nothing to them. His tone, however, did. The oldest boy hesitated, then pushed his sister behind him, his small frame trying to protect her. Captain Harding motioned for his men to hold position. The last thing he wanted was panic. One sudden move, and a trigger could turn mercy into tragedy. He took off his helmet and crouched closer. "No guns," he said quietly. "See?" He placed his rifle on the snow. After a long moment, the boy stepped out, his bare feet red from cold. His clothes hung loose, torn and soaked. His eyes were hollow but alert. He had been surviving on instinct for months. Behind him emerged 6 others, younger, thinner, their faces smeared with soot and ash. One carried a broken doll. Another clutched a tin can filled with snow. The soldiers couldn't look away. War had taught them to see enemies, but these were just children trying not to die. Harding called for his medic, who approached with quiet caution. He pulled chocolate from his pocket, a ration bar, slightly melted. When he broke it in half and handed a piece forward, the youngest girl flinched as if expecting to be struck. Only when her brother nodded did she take it. For a few seconds everything paused. The war, the orders, the fear. Only the sound of chewing, slow and unsure, filled the air. One of the men muttered, "They look like ghosts." They weren't far off. The children hadn't eaten properly in weeks. They'd been living on bark, frozen berries, and what little they could scavenge from burned homes. The oldest boy tried to explain through gestures, pointing toward the woods, then to the sky, mimicking falling bombs. The men understood. Their parents were gone. Harding faced a dilemma no manual had prepared him for. These weren't prisoners. They weren't combatants. Yet taking them in would mean breaking protocol. Every civilian they encountered had to be registered, interrogated, and turned over to local authorities. But how do you turn over children who have no one left? As night approached, the temperature began to drop fast. Harding knew they wouldn't survive another night in the cold. He gave a quiet order. "We bring them back." It wasn't unanimous. One sergeant protested. "Sir, we don't know who they are." "Could be spies. Could be bait." Harding stared at him, tired but resolute. "They're kids, Sergeant. The only thing they're spying on is death." That ended the argument. The soldiers wrapped the children in their coats, carried the smallest ones, and began the slow march back to camp. It wasn't far, but the snow made every step heavy. The children didn't speak. They didn't cry. They simply followed, as if unsure whether this rescue was real or another cruel trick. When they reached the edge of camp, the guards tensed, rifles raised, until Harding waved them down. Inside the barracks, the children were given food: bread, canned soup, water. The oldest boy hesitated before eating, watching the soldiers carefully. Only when one of them took a bite of the same bread did he finally start to eat. That night, for the first time in months, the 7 of them slept indoors, wrapped in blankets instead of rags. But Harding couldn't sleep. He sat outside the tent, staring at the snow falling over the campfires. The war had ended, but it hadn't stopped claiming victims. These children weren't just survivors. They were reminders that no one truly wins a war. As dawn approached, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to hand them over. Not to the authorities, not to the military offices, not to anyone. He was going to protect them himself, no matter what the orders said. Captain Harding stood outside his tent long after midnight, the cold biting through his coat. The war was over, but the orders still felt like chains. His conscience whispered louder than any command ever had. Those children wouldn't survive another transfer. The next morning, a jeep arrived from Division Command. A lieutenant stepped out, polished and precise, clipboard in hand. "Captain Harding," he said briskly, "we have instructions to move the civilians you found. Refugee intake point at Bad Säckingen." Harding's jaw tightened. He'd been to that camp. Mud floors, overcrowded tents, more sickness than food. It wasn't a place for survival. It was a slow disappearance. "With respect, sir," Harding said, "they're too weak to travel." "That's not your call," the officer snapped. "Orders come from Stuttgart. You'll deliver them by tonight." Inside the tent, the children huddled together. The youngest girl, barely 4 years old, clung to her brother's sleeve. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the fear in Harding's voice. The officer left, satisfied that the captain would comply. But the moment the jeep's engine faded into the distance, Harding turned to his men. "We're not sending them there," he said quietly. Sergeant Collins frowned. "Sir, if command finds out—" "They can take my stripes," Harding interrupted. "But they're not taking those kids." The silence that followed was heavy, but no one argued. They had all seen too much. Bombed villages, crying mothers, the endless faces of the displaced. No one wanted to add 7 more to that list. At dusk, they packed in silence. Blankets, tins of food, water flasks. The medic loaded penicillin and bandages into a knapsack. Miller found a small sled from a ruined farmhouse to carry the weakest child. They left the camp as the last light faded behind the trees. No words, just snow underfoot and breath in the cold air. Hours passed. The children followed closely, their steps light but uncertain. Harding led the way, carrying the youngest girl, her head resting against his shoulder. She no longer trembled, just watched the sky as if waiting for dawn. Then came the sound, distant at first, then closer. An engine, headlights sweeping through the forest. "Patrol," Collins whispered. They dropped to the ground. Harding motioned for silence. The light drew closer, cutting through the branches. Voices. "American." "Didn't command say they were out here?" one soldier called. "Yeah, something about refugees." The flashlight beam moved across the trees, closer, closer, until it caught movement. The oldest boy froze, eyes wide. Without thinking, Harding stood up. "Over here!" he called. The beam snapped toward him. "Captain?" one of the patrolmen said, surprised. "What are you doing out here?" "Recon sweep," Harding said calmly. "Got a report of deserters." The soldier frowned. "At this hour?" "Orders," Harding replied. "You know how it is." The men hesitated, then shrugged. "Right, well, nothing out here but trees. You need a ride back?" Harding forced a tired smile. "Appreciate it, but I'll finish this sweep." When the jeep finally turned away, the forest swallowed its light again. Harding let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They moved for hours more, until the woods opened into a clearing. Ahead stood a small stone church, the Red Cross outpost. Lanterns glowed through frosted windows. Inside, nurses rushed to meet them. The children were taken gently by the hand, seated near stoves, wrapped in warm blankets. For the first time, they didn't resist. Harding filled out no forms. He gave no military details. When a nurse asked their names, he simply said, "They're from Freiburg. Their parents are gone." Before he left, the oldest boy approached him, holding out something, a piece of crumpled foil. "The chocolate wrapper from that first day." Harding shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Keep it. For luck." The boy stared at it, then smiled. A faint, fragile smile that cut through the months of fear. Harding turned and walked into the snow. Behind him, faint laughter echoed through the trees, small voices rising into the night, fragile but alive. For the first time in years, he believed that maybe, just maybe, the world could heal. In the months that followed, Germany slowly began to rebuild. The smoke lifted, the ruins thawed, and people emerged from basements, cellars, and forests, each carrying their own version of survival. But for Captain William Harding, the war never truly ended. Not in his mind. Officially, his patrol's rescue report listed 7 unidentified civilians handed over to Allied authorities. The paperwork was clean, the dates aligned, and no one questioned it. Unofficially, those 7 children had crossed the border to Switzerland under the care of the Red Cross and disappeared into safety. Harding never saw them again. He was reassigned in early 1946, returned home later that year, and resumed a quiet life in Kansas. He married, raised 2 children, and worked as a schoolteacher. But sometimes, when winter came and snow fell just right, he'd remember that forest. The silence, the eyes in the dark, and the smallest act of mercy that defied a war's logic. In 1962, a letter arrived from Switzerland. It was written in careful English, signed simply, "From the boy with the chocolate." He had grown up, studied medicine, and was now working with the Red Cross himself, helping children in refugee camps across Europe. He wrote, You told me to keep the wrapper for luck. I still have it. Every time I see a child who is lost or afraid, I remember that day in the snow. I remember that some enemies choose kindness. Harding never replied. He didn't need to. The letter stayed folded in his desk drawer until the day he died. Years later, his daughter found it among his things. The chocolate wrapper, faded and creased, was still inside. She framed it. No medals, no flags, just a piece of silver foil, preserved like a relic of humanity. History books never mention Captain Harding. They rarely mention the nameless children either. Yet somewhere between those forgotten pages lies the truth about what war really leaves behind. Not just ruins, not just victory or defeat, but moments, small, defiant, and human, when compassion overcame orders. The Black Forest stands silent again now. The snow still falls, the trees still whisper. But if you listen closely, you might imagine the echo of laughter, the sound of children who once hid in the dark and found, against all odds, a reason to believe in kindness again. In the silence that followed, the forest remembered everything.